I'm going to keep this one pretty short and sweet. Just one slide here to introduce some of the concepts in a brief reading from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Engels doesn't get enough credit, but he was a co-author with Karl Marx, Engels being English, Marx being German. So it's a short reading, and I'll go briefly. I want to talk about one concept in particular that's alluded to in the reading but doesn't really come out, but I want to do that in class because I have to bring Hegel back in, and I don't want to, there's going to be questions. I want to be there to answer them. As I showed you in class, this is a political compass of some of the authors that we have recently read, and it is accurate. That is not a picture of Hobbes. That is Hobbes's Leviathan in the authoritarian right slot. John Locke in the libertarian right slot. Again, I gave you an overview of Locke. We'll get more into him in a couple weeks' time. Marx, authoritarian left, and Rousseau, who is libertarian left. That's about accurate. I mean, again, it's in some ways a random, you could put anyone into this, but these thinkers all have something to say about the state, what the nature of human beings is, how the nature of human beings can be warped by society. And they're all kind of very interesting to read together. So we will go again into this next slide very briefly. The excerpt that you have is a little weird because it's two readings that they've kind of Frankenstein together. The first is from the German ideology, and then the latter, then there's like a break, there's some stars, and then there's another thing, and that's from the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote for the French Communist Party as their manifesto, and it's probably the most famous thing that Marx wrote. It's certainly the most read, the most accessible. It's very thin. There's like exclamation points in it, right? So it's a manifesto. It's supposed to be accessible to workers, to the working class, as opposed to this, which is Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3. It is inaccessible. It is very, very tough to get through. That's why we draw a distinction sometimes between young Marx and old Marx. Here is a poster for a recent film, a pretty good film, too. Les Jeunes Karl Marx. It is a Raoul Peck film. He's a kind of famous director in documentaries, feature films. And it's about young Karl Marx. Young Karl Marx is the humanist Karl Marx, right? He is interested in, like Rousseau is, he wants to understand the human condition. What is the condition of human beings, or men, right, in a particular moment in time, right? So that is humanism, right? He wants to understand the nature, the essence of human beings, why we do what we do, how we are led astray, how we can get back on course. It is very different from this guy. This is old Karl Marx. This is what is called sometimes the scientific Marx, scientific socialism, this idea that it's a guarantee, like that looking at the history from feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism, Marx says, it is inevitable, writing from the perspective of 1867, and we could very well agree with him in this way. Writing from the perspective of 1867, it is inevitable that there's going to be a socialist revolution. It's going to be a global revolution because capitalism has created a global supply chain, a global economy, and that it is scientific, right? That we can look at the progress of history, look back through hundreds and hundreds of years of economic development, and then look at our current moment and say, what is going to happen? A revolution is going to happen. That is scientific socialism. And there's a difference between the two, right? One is more approachable. It's more about the human element. The latter is a little bit more dense. It's a lot more dense. Marx loves capitalism. This is something that, again, with some philosophers, Aristotle, we pretty much, if we know anything about it, it's probably fine. Other philosophers like Hume or Hegel, we don't know anything about them. So when you jump in and start reading them, you just learn them, right? In a good way, hopefully. Marx is different because Marx, if you know anything about him, it's either probably wrong, or kind of like just off the mark or something, right? You've encountered it through, what your uncle says at Thanksgiving, or what your your meme buddy likes to talk about, whether they're like a tanky leftist meme lord or some kind of, edgy right-wing, whatever, right? But one way or another, it's probably wrong. So we need to spend a little bit more time to try to understand what Marx is all about. And Marx likes capitalism. It's the most efficient system, right, that the world has ever known, right? But it's a very exploitative system. And he says that inevitably, again, this is part of this dialectic, when I talked about Hegel and the dialectics, inevitably, the negation of capitalism exists within capitalism itself, and it's going to blossom, create an antithesis to the thesis, and you're going to have socialism. Then socialism is going to get so efficient that you're not even going to need the state anymore, and you'll have communism. That's the theory of history. But that's the stuff that's scientific, late scientific Marx. Okay, so the specific ideas in the reading. It's a short reading, but there's a lot of stuff crammed in there. The main one is materialism, or dialectical materialism. As I mentioned with Hegel, there's two philosophies that we can talk about. One is idealism, and that is that the ideas come first, right? That human consciousness precedes us. If you're religious, you're an idealist, right? The idea that God creates the world or whatever, and then human beings. That's idealism. You start with the idea, right? You start with the abstract thing, the thing you cannot see, the idea. Materialism is opposite of that. Materialism, you start with the material world, and then out of that material world, we create ideas, right? We create our gods, we create our consciousness, we create our belief systems, and that the stuff we create is formed by the world we live in, right? That people in feudal Europe are going to come up with different ideas than people in 21st century California are going to come up with, right? That the ideas are shaped by the world we live in. That's materialism. And then dialectical materialism is this back and forth, right? We are humans. We are material things. We interact with material things. We have ideas. Those ideas affect our material conditions, right? Things change, revolutions happen, innovations happen, and that changes who we are as human beings, and that changes our ideas, and then our ideas change, right? There's this dialectic back and forth, right? So the way that you all, as young people in 21st century, think about work, right? Or your future as a worker is fundamentally different from someone of my dad's generation, right? And that's largely because of technology, right? A lot of people go into tech, they invent things, they're entrepreneurs, right? Previous generations, it was you go to high school, you get a job, there's going to be a pension, you work for 45 years, you retire, and then that's it. That's your life. That was your vision of employment. That means that your idea and the material surroundings of your world are fundamentally shaped. No one in the 1950s was thinking they were going to invent some app, right? It just wasn't a thing, right? So that's a little dumbed down example of dialectical materialism, right? Homo faber. Homo faber is the making man. This is actually a concept that in Marx's writing about it, he actually quotes Benjamin Franklin, because Benjamin Franklin wrote about this idea of Homo faber, which was, in terms of human evolution, right? We have kind of ape hands. And then as we start to make tools with those hands over the course of thousands of years, our hands become more, you can articulate better, right? They become more, our fine motor skills improve. So the tools we make improve. With those improved tools, we get more fine motor skill, we get better hands. With those better hands, we create more tools. And that fundamentally, that is an important part of being a human is that relationship between our physical existence and labor, the work that we do. That we want to do work. We know it makes us better. It makes us happy. We like working, right? But we like working on things that we like. We don't want to be forced to work on something we don't like, right? We want to do stuff that we love. I see this with my son, right? If you look at any kid, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, right? They love to, dig stuff up and build stuff and like build forts or whatever. It is this natural thing that human beings have that we want to work. That is homo faber, right? That creative humans. So that is in here, right? That people love to work. Second big idea. And I mentioned this a little bit when I talked about just a second about dialectical materialism, that the mode of production influences how we think about the world. The mode of production is, whether it's Marx's time or our time, we live in a capitalist mode of production. Now, the capitalist mode of production in 1860 is like really different than the one we have now. In 1860, it's cotton mills and coal mines and the slave trade and all of this kind of shifting from, well, by 1860, it's fully capitalist, right? But when Marx is writing, he writes about the shift from mercantilism to capitalism. So these are all different modes of production. Feudalist mode of production, mercantilist mode of production, industrial capitalist mode of production, or our, say, 21st century, whatever, right? Internet mode of production, right? That the mode of production influences this idea of homo faber. What we do is work, how we think about work, right? That a feudal peasant is going to think about work in a different way than someone in 21st century United States, right? That the mode of production influences our consciousness. Okay. Putting Hegel on his feet, this is in the reading, you'll see where he says, oh, the German philosophy starts with the ideas, but I want to start with the material. That's a reference to Hegel. That is saying, start with the ideas and then you move to the material. That is the old school Hegelian dialectic. For Marx, he wants to start with the material, then move to the ideas. And then lastly, that the history is the history of class antagonism, right? That when Marx looks at history, whether it's ancient Babylonia or the Israelites or the Gracchi brothers in ancient Rome, he sees that history evolves through class conflict. Some people have stuff, other people don't. They have conflict, right? And that propels history forward, right? Sometimes the masses win, sometimes the elite win, but there's always this fundamental conflict, and that drives history forward. He thinks that conflict is coming to a head under industrial capitalism of the 1860s. And he says, right, it's gonna blow up. You're gonna get socialism, then you're gonna get communism. And then with communism, you have the elimination of that class antagonism so that you effectively have the end of history, right? There's going to be nothing's going to change, right? Once everyone, right, there's no more class antagonism, right? That's communism, and that's it. That's the end of history. So all of these concepts, it's a short reading. Certainly you can read it a lot quicker than the 15 minutes it's taken me to give this lecture. All of these concepts are in here, and they're all like little seeds for bigger ideas that Marx talks about. We'll get into some of these in class, but the one I want to talk about in particular is the idea of alienation. And what alienation does, much like Rousseau thinking that we are, right, that this idea of self-love kind of pulls us out of who we actually are as human beings. For Marx, this idea of alienation is really important, and he takes it from Hegel and then flips it on its head. We'll talk about alienation in class, but this is just a general overview of some of the concepts that come out in our little brief reading on Marx.